Welcome, everybody, to our Calvin University School of Business Award for Scholarship on Christianity and Business. This is our presentation. Thank you so much for coming today. I am sending greetings from our Dean, Jim Ludema, who is out sick this week, wishes that he could be here, and sends he sent a text message, which I got early this morning, and I appreciated. He said he sent his best wishes and congratulations to Rick and wishes that he could be here. I also want to personally thank Rick for flying in from New Jersey to present this paper. Thank you so much for coming. Those of you that have joined us to listen to this scholarship paper presentation, thank you to Ann Gertner and Kristen Groom, who work behind the scenes to make an event like this run smoothly. And especially thank you to the Calvin Center for Innovation in Business for funding this award. The Calvin University School of Business is working to become a leader in Christian business education around the world. And the pursuit of scholarship is essential to this goal. Scholarship helps faculty stay current in their disciplines, and Christian scholarship specifically allows our professors to explore the application of their faith to their own field. The readers of scholarship benefit as it advances the ways that we think about, interpret, and act in our world. Through this award, the Calvin University School of Business seeks to find and promote scholarship that is rigorous, beautiful, interesting, and useful. After a review of many articles related to Christianity and business, our committee, the scholarship support team, selected The Purpose of Business in an Inquisitive Society by Richard Harvey Johnson as the first winner of the CUSB Award for Scholarship on Christianity and Business. When thinking of this article, I often think of the phrase, "When life gives you lemons, make lemonade." Life has certainly given us many lemons in the past few years with the onset first of COVID, which gave us sudden changes that we had to address quickly. And then now a few years beyond the initial COVID impact, we're dealing with lasting difficulties in the field of business. In Rick's article, he challenges businessmen and women to view this difficult time as a unique opportunity, an opportunity to reevaluate business goals, structures, and impacts on society. Rick encourages businesses to avoid the pitfalls of shareholder primacy, which focuses exclusively on building personal wealth, and instead pursue the flourishing of all of a business's stakeholders. Rick is a senior lecturer at the Aurora College of Business and Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey. He holds a PhD in org leadership from Eastern University. He came to higher education after 20 years of leading change management, talent acquisition, and people development strategy in the consumer electronics, medical device, and pharmaceutical industries. And at this time, I'd like to invite Rick to present his award-winning paper, The Purpose of Business in an Inquisitive Society.
Well, hello. Welcome. Thanks for coming out on a Friday afternoon. I know Friday afternoons are tough times to come and sit and listen to a lecture, so we won't spend the next hour lecturing, thank goodness. We will spend a good amount of time discussing as well. But let me start by just, again, sending out some thanks. Thank you to Jill for being my email buddy these past weeks. She's been a great help in getting me here, and I was certainly very happy and surprised to receive her first email. So thank about the award. So Jill, Bob Ames, Jim Ludema, and Jason Stanberry, the committee that selected this article out of a haystack of Christian business literature from 2021. So you all had a great task that you set out for yourselves, sorting through all that, and I appreciate and I'm humbled that you picked my article. I want to thank the Center for Innovation in Business for sponsoring this award. Bob Ames, thanks, and for all the work that center is doing and for the work you're doing. Thank Dean Ludema for his leadership. Sorry he wasn't able to be here today. Jill, Tom Betts, Brian Cawley, Jason Stanberry, and Corey Wilson for their hospitality these past 24 hours, eating meals with me and getting to know one another. It's been terrific. And Gertner and Kristen Grom for their work, all the behind-the-scenes stuff that makes events like this go impossible without that work. So thank you, Ann and Kristen. And the editors of Christian Business Review. This article is in its final state is very different than the first version that I sent to them last year. I was telling folks at lunch that I had an idea about an article responding to their call for papers, and it had about 2 paragraphs about R.H. Tawney in it, and the rest was something completely else, which I saw as greatly related. But they were really fascinated by the Tawney stuff, and yeah, the rest of the stuff, not so much. So we went around 3 or 4 rounds of revision and review, and finally got to something that made sense to all of us. So I'm very grateful for their engagement. And finally, I'd like to thank folks who are not here. Some of my colleagues back at Rowan, Dean Susan Larriman at the Royer College of Business, my associate dean, Morris Kalini, and my department chair, Joel Rudin, who all continue to support my faith-based writing and research in the context of a public university. I count that as a real blessing. So, what I'm going to present to you today is an abbreviated version of that article. I'll have a few new things. Some of it comes from the article itself. Richard Tawney had this threefold framework for what he called a functional society or business for the common good. And we'll talk about that in some detail this afternoon. What's necessary, useful, and beautiful. And so it was fascinating to me that some of that showed up in the criteria that you all were applying. So it's fun that we're using some of the same words. I outlined a bit of a how-to process in the article, and we won't talk so much about the how-to. At least I'm not going to talk at you about the how-to. We can certainly discuss that afterwards. What we'll focus on in terms of my comments will be some stories about practitioners who have done that work, some from the article, some that are new, and try to get our arms around Tawney's framework and start to see if we can, it's a framework that might be useful for us as we stand at this place in human history. So let's get started here. So we'll start with the talking at you part. So a few days ago, I picked up a copy of Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy. Some of you may be familiar with that work. The younger among you, maybe not. I remember seeing Dr. Willard at a Renovari conference in San Jose, California, when my wife and I lived out there, and was going through the foreword and came across the publication page, looked at the publication date, and realized that it had been over 20 years since I had first read the book and seen Dr. Willard. I was surprised at how fast time flies. But there was a line in the foreword that jumped out to me. And that line is this. In these 3 books, he's putting his book, The Divine Conspiracy, in the context of 2 others he had written. In these 3 books, there is very little that is new, though perhaps much that is forgotten. Indeed, if I thought it were new, I would certainly not advocate it or publish it. And so that I thought of this presentation when I read those words. What I'm presenting here today is not new. And by drawing on Dallas Willard here, I'm in no way equating my work with his, but I think the humility with which he approached his work is suitable here today. If I thought I was bringing some revolutionary new insight from the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament, I would hesitate. Indeed, I should hesitate. I think Willard's characterization of his work applies here. What you and I will be discussing this afternoon is not so much new as it is perhaps forgotten or set aside as inconvenient. Ideas and practices regarding sustainable business and economy are embedded in the Christian scriptures and Christian tradition. Too often, I think we've chosen to forget or ignore this advice. Perhaps this afternoon's conversation can be another step forward in trying to bring these ideas to the forefront. So let's do that. let's begin doing that, with the story of a late 19th and early 20th century exemplar of what we would call today social entrepreneurship. Maggie Lena Draper was born to a teenage mother in Richmond, Virginia in 1867. After the death of her stepfather when she was 9 years old, young Maggie supported her mother's laundry business by collecting and delivering laundry to clients after school. Maggie joined the First African Baptist Church Sunday School and came to know Jesus at age 11 during the Great Richmond Revival of 1878. Maggie grew to become a bright and ambitious teenager. She attended Richmond Colored Normal School, the local high school for African American children, that only admitted the top 40 students on a competitive exam every year. And she was among the only 10% who were able to see their education through to graduation in their senior year. Her life of leadership and activism began as a high school student, as she joined the local council of what came to be known as the Independent Order of St. Luke. That was an African American mutual benefit society that fostered close relationships among its members, provided life insurance, and also promoted moral values of love, purity, and charity. Before graduating from high school, Maggie had served as the secretary for her local council of St. Luke's and was elected as the delegate to the National Annual Convention. As a wife and a mother in her mid-30s, Maggie Lena Walker became the Right Worthy Grand Secretary of the Independent Order of St. Luke's. I love that title. That was their chief executive title. We've got to do away with CEO, right? The Right Worthy Grand Secretary. It was fabulous. She, as the organization's chief executive, she saw St. Luke's become a leader in Black economic empowerment. In 1905, the organization incorporated and opened the St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank, which was one of the first Black-owned banks in Richmond, Virginia, installing Mrs. Walker as the first woman president of a bank in the United States. 2 years earlier, the order began the St. Luke's Herald, which was a weekly newspaper, and 2 years later, in 1907, they opened the St. Luke's Emporium, a local department store. Maggie Lena Walker was a social entrepreneur. They didn't call them social entrepreneurs back in those days, but today we would call her a social entrepreneur. She was also a feminist and an activist whose vision of human flourishing for the formerly enslaved was fueled by her faith. Her understanding of Jesus and his care for the marginalized prompted Mrs. Walker to apply St. Luke's core values of love, purity, and charity in a fashion that provided a path out of domestic labor for Richmond's African American community. The St. Luke Herald, the Penny Savings Bank, the St. Luke Emporium not only served Black Richmonders, but employed them, helping to develop skill sets and vocational skills beyond domestic labor. And importantly, she accomplished all of this during the Reconstruction and in the Jim Crow South. Richard Henry Tawney was 16 years Maggie Walker's junior. Born in India and raised in England, he graduated from Oxford and served on the faculty of the London School of Economics. Maggie Walker was a descendant of enslaved Africans, while Richard Tawney was a citizen of an imperialist power. Maggie Walker was a practitioner. R.H. Tawney was an economist and a historian. Yet both were activists whose action and advocacy were deeply rooted in their respective Baptist and Anglican faith traditions. As followers of Jesus, they actively worked to realize what George Eldon Ladd later called kingdom as a present gift, or the already but not now kingdom of God. Not yet kingdom of God. One of Tawney's most influential works, The Acquisitive Society, was published in 1920 as Britain recovered from World War I and the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, making observations perhaps that are relevant for today as people of the earth, all of us, and our fellow image bearers around the world continue to navigate through the COVID pandemic, environmental disruptions, war, various states of social dissatisfaction and unrest. The British social circumstance presented an opportunity, from Tawny's point of view, for reimagining the economic structure of society and an alternative purpose for business, one that is serving the common good, rather than the individualistic purpose of building personal wealth. He envisioned an economy in which business served society, subordinating personal wealth to the common good. The purpose of business is obvious, he wrote. It is to supply humanity with things which are necessary, useful, or beautiful, and thus bring life to body or spirit. Tawny was a critic, an early critic, of what we refer to today as shareholder primacy, management's primary duty to build shareholder wealth. He viewed shareholder primacy as a fundamental flaw of business and industry that was rooted in Western individualism. This individualism resulted in what Tawny described as the acquisitive society, one in which the whole tendency and interest and preoccupation is to promote acquisition of wealth. He contrasted this with what he called a functional society, in which businesses and industries serve a social function or purpose. In a functional society, the purpose of business is to supply humanity with goods and services that are necessary, useful, and beautiful, and thus bring life to body and spirit. Tawny credited humanity, from his historian perspective, he credited humanity with recognizing the social role of economic activity from time to time. He saw some evidence of this in his research, and he celebrated that and recognized that work. He mourned, however, that those activities were generally short-lived, and they predictably succumbed to the forces of individualism, greed, and wealth building. Tawny's primary concern in the acquisitive society was to examine and challenge shareholder primacy and resolve industrial strife in Britain. His narrative traced the development of acquisitive societies in history, and he argued for creating purposeful institutions characteristic of his functional society. The key to emerging from the tragedy of World War I and the influenza pandemic was understanding the purpose of business from a proper perspective. That perspective views economic interest as but one aspect of life. It encourages citizens to put aside opportunities for wealth building that do not bring life by being necessary, useful, or beautiful. A proper view of industry subordinates wealth building to meeting social needs by recognizing business as the servant, not the master, of society. It's important to note here that Tawny understood capital and profit as necessary. Its purpose and deployment were his points of concern. He drew distinctions between capital invested and profits taken by owners and managers who were actively involved in the business versus shareholders who had no direct interest in the company other than profiting from their investment. Tawny was also a product of his time. He was a Christian socialist who served on a commission that recommended coal industry nationalization in Britain, which Parliament did not implement, by the way. However, we have to be careful not to dismiss Tawny's observations and perspectives because of the solutions he advocated. Tawny himself recognized that time and circumstances change. And as such, so do potential solutions. He viewed his writings as contextual or topical, as platforms from which to measure society's changes over time. And as societies and problems evolve, so will their potential solutions. So Tawny's reflections on the potential for a functional society in which wealth serves the interests and needs of society rather than simply increasing shareholder prosperity were deeply rooted in his understanding of Jesus as God incarnate. The incarnation and the Trinity were foundational to Tawny's belief in equality and human dignity. This belief had implications for industry and society. Equality was the foundation for order, authority, and justice. A belief in equality means that nothing can justify my use of power which chance gives me, the chance of a majority as well as wealth or birth to the full. That nothing can justify my using my neighbor as a tool or treating him as something negligible which may be swept aside to realize my ends, however noble those ends may be. We can imagine Maggie Walker and Richard Tawney agreeing on this point as perhaps the foundation for their respective work. Indeed, we can imagine this quote being spoken or written today in a discussion of social justice. Tawney's understanding of the value of the human person, relationships between persons, and justice are consistent with the biblical concept of shalom. The Hebrew word shalom and the Greek word irene are commonly translated into English as peace, but shalom, of course, has a much broader and deeper meaning in the Hebrew Bible, and also that same meaning applies to irene in the New Testament. Shalom encompasses completeness, fulfillment, individual and relational wholeness, community, harmony, tranquility, friendship, prosperity. Nicholas Wolterstorff describes shalom as the human person living in peace with and enjoying or delighting in relationships with God, with themselves, others, and the natural world. A more representative translation of shalom into English might be well-being in every dimension of life, or flourishing, the full development of the God-given design and potential in all persons. Importantly, shalom or flourishing is only realized in the context of justice. Shalom is the real presence and fruition of divinely created design and intention in the created order and requires objectively realized justice. Shalom cannot be achieved by simply persuading people that they are happy or content in their situation. Tawney's purpose of business in a functional society to supply humans with goods and services that are what? Necessary, useful, and beautiful. We'll have all three of those words down by the end of today. And thus bring life to body and spirit, is a conception of business that honors and promotes human flourishing both inside and outside the organization. So this applies to the larger community as well as the community of workers. He also recognized that human flourishing is dependent upon the flourishing of our natural environment. All of this is similar to the common good theme found in many contemporary Christian examinations of the purpose of business. The common good purpose of business recognizes humanity as created in the image of God, and as such, each person has inherent dignity and worth and is made for relationship. Further, each person is inherently creative and has been called by the Creator to partner with Him in stewarding his natural and his social creation. This stewardship requires work, which is also part of God's good created order and also has inherent value. The common good purpose of business is to partner in God's mission of redemption by creating for-profit workplace communities that produce goods and services that promote human flourishing inside and outside the organization. This includes providing meaningful and creative work, facilitating the healing of economic relationships throughout the supply chain, and giving voice to the marginalized. Tawney's functional society sought personal, social, and environmental well-being or flourishing, and he understood the vital role business and industry played in realizing that flourishing. While the specific solutions he proposed from his Christian socialist perspective are unlikely to gain traction in early 20th century United States, his aspirations as a follower of Jesus remain relevant today. Indeed, they've been similarly articulated by our contemporaries. It seems fitting then for us to follow in Tawney's tradition as we emerge from the pandemic era that brought economic, social, and environmental challenges to the fore. Now is the time to recommit ourselves to structuring businesses and institutions that actively facilitate human flourishing. The good news is that there are companies, large and small, that are striving to do that. Some excel at caring for people, others tending to the earth, while others creating sustainable value. All are actively seeking creative ways to help realize what Tawny would have referred to as a functional society. So Tom Landis opened his first Howdy homemade ice cream store in Dallas, Texas in 2015. Tom had prior success in the restaurant business, but imagined and designed the Howdy concept for a different purpose. His goal was not simply to make money selling good, original ice cream, and they do, and it's too bad we didn't have some shipped here today, right, from Dallas, but to create a business that could be staffed and run by neurodivergent employees, such as those with Down syndrome or people on the autism spectrum. Landis's experience as a restaurateur taught him that positive customer experience is crucial to success, but really difficult to deliver. Exceptionally high employee turnover rates, fierce competition among restaurants for qualified staff, and constant hiring and training of new staff were persistent challenges. Tom also recognized an untapped pool of potential employees gifted in welcoming strangers, making people happy, and who are eager to learn and want meaningful work. Howdy Homemade is organized to hire, develop, and run each store with a predominantly neurodivergent workforce. And this includes in the management ranks as well. It's a business about people first and then food, says Landis. We want our ice cream to be as good as our people. Tom's business model prioritizes caring for people by designing his business to provide work and a career path for neurodivergent folks, an often marginalized group in our society. The relationship Howdy Homemade has built goes far beyond those with his employees, however. The COVID-19 pandemic affected Howdy Homemade, as it did most other hospitality businesses. By late 2020, his business model was at risk. In September of that year, the outlook for Howdy Homemade was not good, but the community stepped in by raising over $100,000 on a GoFundMe page. This money was used to keep the enterprise going and to invest in an ice cream truck that now serves Howdy Homemade treats in a socially distanced manner. And they continue to use that truck now, even as some of the pandemic restrictions have receded. As Tom Landis said in a recent interview, it's no longer our restaurant, it is truly the city of Dallas's restaurant. And now the company is expanding beyond Dallas. Last year they opened their first store in Katy, Texas, and they've recently opened a store in the Carolinas as well. Ralph Brochi had a dream as a teenager to establish an orchard and use the profits to feed hungry children. Ralph and his wife Cheryl bought their first cherry orchard in 1968. They later sold that land and expanded into apples. In the 1980s, they saw a shift in their central Washington seasonal workforce from predominantly local residents who were no longer interested in doing farm labor to migrant workers, many from Mexico. The Brochis set out to learn more about their new workers and came to empathize with their situations, the difficulties of migrant life, the problems associated with the safety of workers and their children as they moved from farm to farm with the seasons, and their aspirations for a better life. So the Brochis dedicated to redesign and operate their business in a way that could help meet these needs. They began by modifying their business model, by adding packing to growing. They provided cold storage. They expanded their tree varieties to extend the harvest season. Ralph also experimented with new apple varieties, eventually patenting Brochi Orchard's own variety, the opal, a sweet and tangy fruit that doesn't turn brown when the flesh is exposed to air. These changes meant that Brochi Orchards could offer a large number of workers full-time jobs year-round, resulting in families not being on the road all year. Their workers could establish a home. The Brochis soon created an on-site child care center, really unusual in the agricultural industry, to care for children and keep them safe while the parents were working in the fields or in the packing facility. Then they began building housing for their employees and families. A community named Vista Hermosa by the workers, or Beautiful View. A school was eventually established, along with a chapel, laundry, and a convenience store. And now, a number of Vista Hermosa children are becoming first-generation college students. Like Maggie Walker and Tom Landis, Cheryl and Ralph Brochi designed their business model to care for people. They employed and improved the lives of people often marginalized in our society by creating value through their operation of a financially sustainable business. For the Brochis, this included innovating product lines and agricultural practices. Brochi Orchards was sold in 2019 to the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan for an undisclosed amount amid challenges related to industry consolidation, climate change, water rights, and agricultural labor shortages. The company formed to operate the orchards, First Fruits Farms, say that 5 times really fast, that's a hard one, intends to continue operating according to the values that guided the Brochis. So whether designing a common good business from scratch or transforming an existing business, it's essential that our work be guided by an understanding of human flourishing and God's shalom. R.H. Tawney argued that industry's primary purpose should be facilitating human flourishing by creating goods and services that are useful, necessary, and beautiful. His threefold framework can be useful for us today. Speaking and living God's shalom as followers of Jesus will help us avoid succumbing to the temptations of individualism and to build companies that bring life to body and spirit of our fellow image bearers by delivering products and services that are necessary, useful, and beautiful. Well, that's it. Thanks.
We have time for question and answer, so about 15 minutes to ask questions of Rick. So I'll open it up to you guys. Anybody have any questions?
And if not, I have some questions, maybe we can get them started. That's some questions for them to discuss among themselves.
You want to do that? That's
Can we
great.
try that?
Yeah, you can try that.
Yeah.
Okay.
'Cause this is always hard, right? After somebody talks at you for a half hour, to come up with questions. And nobody wants to be the first, whether you're an adult or a college student. Oh, okay, now we've got some. Okay.
Leonard, go ahead.
Talk about public companies, because both your exemplars are private companies and they're inspiring, but there's a lot of public companies out there too. How does this thinking, where have you seen this thinking work well in a public company context?
Yeah, a couple that I'll talk about off the top of my head here. So one is Interface Carpets, which is actually one that I included in the article. They're not necessarily a Christian company, but they certainly abide by Tawny's ideas of what good, necessary, and useful. Interface Carpet, I don't know, anybody familiar with Interface Carpet? Heard of a few people, yeah? So they actually make more than carpets now, it's Interface flooring. But these are probably carpet tiles here on this floor. Bob, do you know if we bought this carpet from Interface Carpet? Who knows? Yeah. Who knows? Yeah, there's... Yeah, it's Interface, and there's like 2 or 3 others, right? So it's a pretty small world in that industry. But Interface Carpet is a publicly held company. And over 20 years ago, Ray Anderson, the late Ray Anderson, had an epiphany of sorts. He uses religious language to describe this experience, even though it's not clear what his faith position was. He was a disciple of sorts of Paul Hawken at the time. And he was making carpet tile. That was the business they were in. But he was convicted that by the impact that his business was having on the natural world. The product itself is fully synthetic, so it's made from oil and oil byproducts. The way they ran their factories, which were largely in the United States at the time, but now they're a global firm, was on fossil fuel. So the impact was tremendous. And he set a goal with his leadership team that by 2020 they would be carbon neutral in both the manufacture of the way they manufacture the products and in the product itself. And a lot of the technology for doing that did not exist at the time. But it's a really remarkable story of engaging internally. So this is a public held company, and they had to go to their investors and convince them that he wasn't crazy and to kick him out, right? And they were actually able to do that. They funded a lot of the research and development work internally through applying lean principles and Six Sigma and all that sort of stuff. So they used the savings from that to fund their internal research. Anderson said, well, it doesn't do any good for us to have a clean manufacturing environment if our supply chain is what he would call brown, meaning it was a polluting supply chain. So they had to work with their suppliers as well. And they managed to get to carbon neutral by 2020, and their focus now is on restoration. Is how do we work and sell and create in a way that actually helps restore the natural environment as opposed to just not make things any worse. One of their products that is along this restoration line is, I talked about it in the article now, I can't remember the name of the product line specifically, but they partnered with their fiber supplier, Aquafil, which is an Italian company, and the Zoological Society of London, ZSL as they would call it over there, to work with fishing villages in the Philippines. They also work in Cameroon, and I think one or two other places now, to gather discarded fishing nets out of the fishing areas of those countries. So nets that had been abandoned, they're causing all sorts of environmental problems in the natural habitat. They created actually local banks, citizen-run banks to finance this, and they provided some capital, but now these operations are self-sustaining. The fisher people in the areas don't abandon that lifestyle, but this work helps to create extra money for them. They go out and they bring in the fishing nets, they package them a certain way. Aquafil buys those fishing nets, they bring them to Italy, they recycle the fibers and turn them back into fiber nylon that can be used in carpets, which is then used by Interface to put into carpets. So it's really, really a remarkable thing. But this Interface is a great example of a company that completely redid their supply chain, right? Reimagined it, completely redid it. Investors supported it. And they, of course, have had their ups and downs over the years, but through recessions, they tend to lose less of their market value than their competitors, and they do well during boom times. Another example is Danone, a French company, who is probably the best example right now of the controversy that's created when you set down a path of sustainable business. Their CEO, I think, is no longer the CEO, and they've had some changes, largely due to the direction that he took them in to create a more sustainable business. Danone, under his leadership, became a certified B Corp and is following a benefit corporation sort of strategy. They still make money, but they're not making as much money as they used to. And some investors feel like they've lost their way a bit, that management has focused too much on sustainability and not enough on building shareholder wealth. And so there's a bit of a shareholder revolt now in some circles. And there's a debate in the board of directors, and management is trying to refocus a bit. So these kinds of moves are not without controversy, for sure. But a couple of examples of publicly traded companies that are trying to do that. Yeah. Thanks for asking. Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
Hi. I'm curious if we're looking at functional versus acquisitive, so those two buckets. Would you or Tani have an issue with someone who, say, from a personal wealth perspective, invests in new technology to gain personal wealth, but that brings about something beautiful?
Right, yeah. So it's interesting. Tani, he differentiated between investors that had really investors who would use the stock market, I guess. So I own some shares of Johnson & Johnson, right? I used to be an employee, but not anymore. And he wasn't a big fan of that kind of investment, but certainly didn't have any problem with owners and managers, entrepreneurs making money. He felt like there was more of a connection, that they weren't in it just typically. Entrepreneurs, in his experience, were not in it just to make money, but there was a purpose usually behind it. And he felt like if he could redirect that to being useful, necessary, and beautiful, that he could leverage that entrepreneurial activity. So yeah, I would say, just in the general framework that you provided, I'd say he would probably support that. Yeah. Jason.
So it's always fun here about examples of stakeholder capitalism, right? And Howdy Ice Cream reminds me of Boise Fry Company that employs refugees, and I'm reminded also with the apple orchard of Milton Hershey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Building Hershey, Pennsylvania, to be a good town for his workers to live in.
That's right.
And some of those have been faith-inspired across history. Many instances of shareholder capitalism are not. So I guess one question I have is, those of us who are teaching the next generation of business people, do we want to say this is a powerful movement, right, within business, get with the program as Christians? Or is there something different about the way Christians ought to do stakeholder capitalism in light of a shalomological approach, or in light of a Tantian approach?
Yeah. So thanks. For me, I think too often on social issues like this, the church doesn't lead, where we have had a unique foundation to actually lead in these instances. Oftentimes, we appear to get on the train a little bit late, right? Wait for the next train, and then we'll follow it, and then apply our biblical principles to that circumstance. And so, I think there's a little bit of that, but as you noted, preceding Milton Hershey, right, with the Cadbury brothers in England, who did have a faith-based reason for creating what they called their factory in a garden, that Hershey modeled his work off of. That's why I think Connie's work, or his book, The Acquisitive Society, resonated to me. Some of those observations is that we've had these great moments as entrepreneurs operating as believers in Jesus, that where people applied faith principles in commercial settings, and then it just kind of fades away. And then the church has never really embraced it and said, yes, this is what we should be doing. We should be leading here. I think sometimes because it's really hard and it's very countercultural. We were talking at lunch, Catholic social teaching came up a little bit, and over the years, Catholic social teaching had some really interesting and hard things to say about workers and workers' rights and what capitalism should be and shouldn't be, and whether or not you agree with everything that came out in those letters, the reality is that being a disciple of Jesus in the commercial world is really challenging and sometimes countercultural, and it challenges our how do we navigate that narrow path. Sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't do it as well. Sometimes we support one another, sometimes we don't. So I think the church can lead and should lead. I think we have a better foundation today than just the general humanistic management folks. If you're operating just from a basis that people are inherently valuable, that is absolutely the case. But why is that? We have a unique perspective on that. And we have, I think, a longer-term, better foundation for advocating for stakeholder capital, what we would call today stakeholder capitalism, than some of our contemporaries. But that, I don't mean to say that we should set ourselves aside from them. We should partner with and embrace folks who are willing to go along with us on that same train. We may be coming from a different perspective in terms of our foundation, but if we're going in a similar direction, let's go with them. Let's partner with them. Does that answer your question? What did I miss?
See you over dinner.
Yeah.
I had a question
Yeah,
because we
sure.
have some students in the back row, and I'm wondering for like a student that's maybe about to graduate from college, and in your paper you talk about a lot of things that I think managers can do to take this approach to producing necessary, useful, and beautiful goods. But what does this mean for a student that might think, oh, that's great, I like that idea, but I'm gonna be like a new employee in a workplace? Do you have any words of advice for them or comments on them?
First of all, thanks for coming to a lecture on a Friday afternoon. That is very impressive. I'm not sure you would have caught many of my students coming to a lecture on Friday afternoon, so thank you. Let's see. So as a new, getting your career just started, how do you make a difference, right? How do you move towards creating what Tani would call a functional society? I think there's a few things. So one is choosing the organization you're going to go work for, right? Are they making things that are useful, necessary, and beautiful? Are they contributing to the flourishing of humanity? I know down in in my neck of the woods in New Jersey and Philadelphia, southern New Jersey, the Philadelphia area, there's a lot of casinos. And they are great employers, excuse me. And a lot of students work there part-time, and they do well, and they make money, and it helps to finance their careers, and that's fine. But as a career path, is that something you really want to do, right? Is that work, is that service, is that entertainment that industry providing, is it really helping humanity flourish, right? So whether it's, and I don't mean to beat up on the gambling industry, but any other industry, there are others as well, right? Are they really helping society flourish? And so I think that'd be the first thing. Be intentional about the organization you pick to go work for, and then as you're doing your work, I think humility is important. Don't expect that you're going to, particularly if it's a large organization, don't expect that you're going to turn that ship on a dime. But advocate where you can, right? Learn what's going on, learn and understand why are they making the decisions that they are. What are the complexities of those decisions? Because running a business is one of the hardest things you'll ever do in your life. It is really super complex, and the inputs and the outputs and all the variables and all the things that are moving all the time make it really difficult to run a business. So from the outside, whatever decisions an organization may not completely line up with useful, necessary, and beautiful, and may not, in the moment, contribute to the flourishing of humanity. But try to understand why those decisions were made, and then reflect on, are there ways that the organization could do it differently, and are there things that I can do to help influence that? And influence is a funny thing, right? So in organizational behavior, you study influence and power and all that sort of stuff. It's a challenging thing, but applying all of those frameworks that you learn throughout your 4 years here and in those classes will be useful tools for you to start to see if you can build a path towards gaining more influence and then being able to help steer those ships as you go on. But yeah, the first thing I think is choose a company that is purposeful and that you're excited about that business. And that's going to give you the energy to pursue the more difficult things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, you're welcome. So what else? Other questions? Anybody think that this is just a whole bowl of nonsense? that Richard Taney is this crazy socialist from historic Britain that doesn't belong in a 21st century conversation about business.
I did have a question that came up as you were talking, and I'm thinking about Tawny presenting these ideas 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They've been out there. What do you think? Why do you think it's not? Well, first, do you think it's not the dominant mindset today? I mean, we have lots of examples, but I'm kind of thinking it hasn't caught on as the dominant mindset. And why not? If it's been out there for 100 years, like why hasn't it changed the way we do business? In your opinion?
Yeah, boy. I think Tawny, I would go back to Tawny, just Western individualism is a real challenge, right? That's in our DNA. And even as believers in Jesus in the West, right, it's something that shapes the church, it shapes how we think about the church, how we think about our faith. If we go to the global South, some of our ideas about what church is and what Christianity is just, completely different, right? So I think a lot of it's just rooted in our history in Europe and North America, and I think that's why.
And I'll add to that, Jill. I mean, I think my question was sort of similar to Leonard's. I think in a capitalist society, right, the underlying assumption is that you're trying to make profit, and so this is a balance, right? It's a balance choosing profit over good in some cases, right? Some companies make decisions to do that because they believe that if they do the right thing, that will also help sell products, right? So, it's rare that large public companies aren't helping their communities in some way, but they pick and choose, right? It's not sort of part of the structure. And that's always going to be a balance, I think, in a capitalist society. It's a tough balance.
It is. And sometimes it's costly. So this is not easy to do, right? Sometimes you'll hear it said that we do well by doing good, or some version of that paraphrase, right? And that's not always the case. Sometimes people are doing good and the business fails. It's just the business model isn't sustainable, right? Or sometimes people are trying to change the way an organization operates, and the board does kick them out, and the business goes a completely different way. So this doing business this way takes courage. It's risky, and it's not easy. So that's perhaps another reason that.
I mean, just one follow-on to that. I mean, I think we're coming to a bit of a choke point now, that we're facing, very arguably, right, a global environmental crisis. And corporations have to step up to that. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what decisions corporations make on that front for the sort of the future of everybody, or whether governments have to step in and say, well, thou shalt do it this way, and that's the only way we're going to fix this, right? We have very dysfunctional governments in many parts of the world, unfortunately, where we sit. And so, this is going to be very interesting to watch. And I hope Christians can be a big part of fixing that problem. So.
Yeah, I hope so too. The late Ray Anderson from Interface Carpet, he made the argument that industry had, because of its capital creation and et cetera, is the most influential institution on earth, right? And that if industry as a whole decided to address the environmental crisis, address these social issues, that the world would be a better place. The problem is that industry is decentralized, right? There's no one czar of industry. And that they actually tried that in a few countries and didn't work out very well. So the challenge is, how do you get how do you herd the cats, right? How do you get us all to agree that this is a better thing to do? And maybe it's the climate crisis that does that. I don't know. Yeah. Let's see.
Time for about one more question.
One more. Last one.
That's what Bernie, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
phrase this properly. I've had scenarios in the past where, actually I had a student once come into my management senior seminar about 4 years ago and said, I just had a class in another department and they said you can't be a capitalist and a Christian. And then you get that sort of general sort of lukewarm skepticism from people sometimes in other fields who don't really know what we teach in business and management, and they suspect we just slam the door shut and say make lots of money, and you know that's pretty much as far as it goes. Is there a sort of an elevator pitch version of this that you would use in conversation with professors or students who might be unsure or skeptical about how capitalism as a thing can actually be used well and for the good? That would, you know, if they didn't have time to hear your whole talk, would there be sort of a briefer version that you could say to them?
Yeah, a brief version. Many faculty have probably had that same question or heard that same issue in this classroom. Before I give my 2 cents, I'm wondering how any of the others of you responded to that. Anybody
I can
have
tell you very
advice?
quickly how I did,
Yeah,
which was
sure,
I was
yeah.
to say that a lot of people blame capitalism being done badly or sinfully on the thing itself. And I said to the student, I said, look, if you think I'm a terrible prof when you've taken my class and you go back to the dorms and say, don't take a class with Fever, right? You're not saying it's bad to be a professor, you're saying it's bad to be that one, right? You know, well, I don't like him. Or if you don't like the president, or maybe you didn't like the previous one, you don't say it's bad to be a president, you say, I don't like that one, or I didn't like this one. But when it comes to capitalism, it's the thing itself that gets the blame, and not the people that really, really make a huge mess and do things very unethical that cause a huge amount of press.
I would even agree with that and springboard off it and say, well, if someone says you can't be a Christian and a capitalist, then I'd say, what do you mean by capitalist? And if by capitalist they mean someone who has sold their soul to mammon, then I would say by definition that is true. You cannot serve both God and money. And then like you have to unpack, okay, well, what do we mean by sold your soul to mammon? What are the alternatives, right? But you know, Aristotle talked about natural chemismatics versus unnatural chemismatics, and the idea that money is not a good in itself. It's not a good of first intent. It's only useful because you can buy other things with it. And so if you are doing business just to accumulate as a good of first intent, something that cannot be a good of first intent. You can't eat it, right? Like, then Aristotle would just say, that's just silly. And I think the fact that people sometimes fall into that trap, right, and allow themselves to use, as Ted Turner once said, he said, life is a game, right? Money is how we keep score. And so if you use money as kind of your way of evaluating your worth as a person, well, then I would say it's not any particular behavior or belief that makes you a Christian. It's the sovereign grace of the Lord Jesus Christ that makes you a Christian. But those behaviors, those beliefs are not consistent with the work of the Holy Spirit in one's life. So I guess I would treat it as, what do you mean by capitalist? And I think if we just say someone who participates in the productive system that requires the generation of capital to house us and produce our goods, I'm not sure I have an objection to that. I think rather I don't. What would you say?
Yeah, and sometimes you hear that just amongst faculty in different colleges, right? I'm not saying that happened here, but at places I've been, you'd hear some of that. Some of the tension, right? The tension between colleges or departments on that very issue, that you can't be a capitalist or you can't be a business person and a Christian. So the big picture, I think Tawny provides us a good argument here. Some of our contemporaries over the past 10, 15 years have really done great work. Bruno Dyke out at University of Manitoba, all the friends out at Seattle Pacific, folks here in this room, in this building, have done, I think, some really good work around trying to help us understand what does it mean to integrate our faith and be a Christian and be a business person. And in the short conversation in the hallway with a student that came to me with that question, right? I might say, well, assuming we were both believers, I'd say, well, okay, so let's think about this for a minute, right? First, I would actually respond with a question and say, well, tell me a little bit more about what you mean there, right? What are you thinking about, and why is that the case? And then, just on the face of it, I might say, well, let's. The Old Testament's a little harder, but there are lots of examples in the New Testament of people who were followers of Jesus who were conducting business. And Jesus didn't rebuke them. He didn't cast them out. He didn't talk to them like he spoke to the Pharisees or the religious leaders of the time. The church embraced those folks, and the apostles embraced those folks, right? So there, just on its face, we've got a contradiction. So what's that contradiction? Probably not going to solve it right here in the hallway now, but that suggests to me that, well, maybe it isn't quite that black and white, and let's talk about this in class some more, or in office hours, or exchange some emails and talk about it. Yeah. All right. So that's a little more hopeful way to end the talk, right? Yeah. And as Jill mentioned, I am hopeful. We've got a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world right now. People who are older like me have lived through other periods of crazy stuff going on. And the church showed up. There were amazing things that happened in the church and happened in society because of the church showing up. And I think the church can show up again. And I think the church will show up again. And the church is showing up again. We just need to bring some of our fellow believers along with us and help realize God's kingdom here on earth, right? It's the already but not yet kingdom. And I'm pretty excited about the already. And I think you're here because you are too. And we can make a difference. So thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you for ending us on that very positive note. And I would like to officially present you with this. I'm going to put my notes down here. And so, congratulations, Rick, on being our first, this is the 2022 winner of the Calvin University School of Business Award for Scholarship on Christianity and Business. It's a mouthful. Yeah, and here's a beautiful award to honor you in that, and there's an honorarium as well, and congratulations. So,
thank you.
Shake your hand. Thank you. Thank everybody for attending and participating. Thank you for your attention, and we'll dismiss this event. Those of you that are joining for the small dinner afterwards, we're going to the Hickory Room in the Prince Conference Center. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.